Liora arrives at a quiet seaside cottage, attempting to apply the rigid precision of her professional past to a slower way of life. Through the guidance of new friends, a shy calico cat, and the tactile art of pottery, she begins to let go of her city-bred urgency. Listen as Liora discovers the beauty of imperfection and the warmth of a community that welcomes her exactly as she is. The weight of linens. Liora snapped the linen sheet over the mattress with a professional flick, the fabric blooming before settling with a precise thud. It was a movement born of 15 years in Michelin-starred kitchens, where a crooked garnish was a moral failing. She smoothed the edges with her palm, ensuring the hospital corners were tight enough to hold a coin. The cottage smelled of cedar oil and salt, but the air felt thick, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting to see if she would survive the silence. Standing in the center of the room, Liora instinctively rubbed her thumb against her fingertips. In the void of the countryside, the phantom noise of the city surged, the clatter of sauté pans, the rhythmic chop of a mezzaluna, and the guttural shouting of sous-chefs coordinating a Saturday rush. Her pulse still beat in the tempo of a dinner service, a frantic 4/4 time that didn't belong in a place where the only clock was the tide. The silence of Salt Spray Cove wasn't an absence of sound, but a weight pressing against her eardrums. Liora walked to the wooden table and opened her leather-bound planner. She uncapped her pen and drafted recovery schedules with surgical precision. 8,000 to 08,030, morning hydration and light stretching. 8,030 to 0930, mindful observation of the coastline. 09,030 to 09, 1,000,045, reading. She wondered if she could shave 5 minutes off the observation if the weather was poor, redistributing that time to a breathing exercise. Peace, she decided, was a skill to be mastered. She would approach it with the same rigor used to perfect a consommé. A draft stirred the curtains, bringing the smell of brine and old paper from a stack of books. Liora paused, her pen hovering over 10 thawed, introspective journaling. For a moment, the salt air bypassed her analytical mind, triggering a memory of cold Atlantic spray from a childhood trip. The scent was a sensory variable she hadn't accounted for. She blinked, her thumb resuming its frantic rub, and forced her gaze back to the grid. The schedule was the only thing keeping the internal noise from becoming a roar. 3 rhythmic knocks sounded at the door. Liora checked her watch, a sleek piece that tracked her heart rate and sleep cycles. It was 10,012. She wasn't expecting anyone. The grocer wasn't due until noon. She felt a spike of irritation at the breach of the timeline. She smoothed her apron, a habit she hadn't yet broken, and opened the door. Standing on the porch was a woman who seemed to have drifted in with the tide. Giselle Beaumont didn't so much enter the room as permeate it. She wore an oversized linen tunic the color of a bruised plum, her silver hair gathered in a knot that looked ready to surrender to gravity. Her voice was a low, airy murmur that stretched the seconds of conversation like taffy. "The light is particularly honest today, don't you think, Liora?" Giselle asked, her French accent slowing the tempo of the room. She stepped inside, trailing a scent of dried lavender and solvent, and glanced at the open planner as if the ink were merely a suggestion. "I've just arrived," Liora said, her voice clipped. "I'm organizing my transition period to maximize recovery. I have a window for visitors between 2 and 4, but I can perhaps shift my reading block if—" "I once spent an entire summer in Provence restoring a sideboard from the mid-19th century," Giselle interrupted, her voice drifting like a leaf on a stream. She wandered toward the window, movements fluid and devoid of urgency. It was mahogany, deeply scarred by a century of spilled wine and careless keys. The owner wanted it pristine, he wanted the wood to forget its history. But I found a deep gouge in the center, a scar where a heavy iron pot had fallen decades ago. It was a violent mark, truly. But it gave the piece a soul. I spent 3 weeks deciding how to treat that one flaw. Liora shifted her weight, glancing at her watch. "That sounds meticulous. But regarding the village customs, is there a time for the market?" "The beauty is never in the polish," Giselle continued, ignoring the interruption. "It is in the break. Wabi-sabi. The idea that the crack is where the light enters. By leaving the scar, it became a story." Giselle turned to Liora and performed a slow, lingering blink. The gesture was so deliberate that Liora froze, her internal clock stuttering. The frantic ticking of her mental stopwatch slowed until it almost stopped. For the first time in years, Liora forgot to check the time. She watched the way Giselle occupied the space, not by filling it, but by allowing herself to be part of it. There was no tension in the woman's shoulders, no urgency in her breath. She was a contrast to everything Liora had ever been, a woman who existed in the present tense without trying to optimize it. "You have a very disciplined hand," Chassel said, glancing at the planner. She produced a small ceramic bowl from her pocket. It was a muted, earthy gray, but a jagged crack ran from the rim to the base, held together by a shimmering line of gold lacquer. She placed it atop the recovery schedule, masking the block for introspective journaling. "A gift," Giselle murmured. "A reminder that some things are more useful once they have been broken." Liora looked at the gold vein celebrating the fracture. The object felt grounded and stubbornly imprecise, a physical contradiction to the grid beneath it. "I must go," Giselle said, drifting back toward the door. She paused at the threshold with a faint, knowing smile. "Your schedule is a very beautiful cage, my dear, but you cannot learn to breathe if you have already decided when the breath should happen." The door clicked shut. Liora stood in the silence, the smell of lavender lingering. She studied the leather-bound planner, the allocated minutes, and the rigid structure she had built to protect herself. Then she studied the cracked bowl, the gold filling the void. She reached out to touch the ceramic, her thumb rubbing against her fingertips, but for once, the movement felt redundant. She realized with a sudden, cold clarity that she had no idea how to actually be still. A calico guest. A sharp, insistent scratching at the back door sliced through the silence, pulling Liora away from the gold-veined bowl. It wasn't the polite tap of a visitor, or the wind rattling the frame. It was the sound of something determined and small. Liora stood still for a heartbeat, her thumb instinctively rubbing against her fingertips. The internal noise, the ghost of a kitchen line during a Saturday rush, the phantom ringing of a telephone, had just begun to subside when the scratching returned, more urgent this time, accompanied by a low, questioning mewl. She opened the door to a wall of salt-heavy air and a flash of orange, white, and black. A calico cat sat perched on the edge of a sprawling, overgrown hydrangea bush, its fur a chaotic map of patches. The cat didn't move toward her. It simply stared with wide, amber eyes, its ears twitching toward the sound of the distant surf. It looked as if it had been sculpted from the very earth and sea of Salt Spray Cove, weathered, cautious, and stubbornly present. Liora leaned against the doorframe, observing the creature's stillness. In the city, animals were accessories or nuisances. Here, the cat seemed to be an inhabitant with its own agenda. Leora's first instinct was to optimize the encounter. She stepped back into the kitchen and reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen to search for a guide on feline integration or a local shelter's lost and found registry. She wanted a protocol. She wanted a set of steps to ensure the cat felt welcomed without being overwhelmed, a checklist for domestic harmony. But as she began to type, a soft velvet brush against her ankle made her jump. The cat had entered. It didn't wait for an invitation or a strategic approach. It simply flowed past her legs like a spill of ink, its tail a questioning hook. Liora watched it vanish into the guest room, the space where she had planned to spend the afternoon meticulously organizing her wardrobe by fabric weight. She followed the cat slowly, the leather-bound planner still sitting on the table with the gold-filled bowl weighing it down. The guest room smelled of old cedar and dried salt. The calico had claimed a patch of sunlight on the faded Persian rug, sitting with its back to her, though its ears remained pivoted in her direction. Liora stood in the doorway, feeling the strange friction of a variable she couldn't control. The cat wasn't following a schedule. It wasn't optimizing its sunlight intake. It was simply existing in the gap between the seconds. "I imagine the house feels a bit too quiet for one person." A voice drifted through the open window, melodic and warm. Liora turned to see Farah al-Sayed standing in the small garden, holding a ceramic pot that steamed in the cool coastal air. Farah wore a linen apron stained with the green ghosts of crushed herbs, and her face held the kind of deep-set kindness that suggested she knew everyone's secrets and judged none of them. She stepped inside without waiting for a formal summons, her movements fluid and unhurried. The scent of chamomile and honey preceded her, a fragrance so thick and comforting it felt like a physical blanket. "I brought a brew for the nerves," Farah said, her open palms gesturing vaguely toward the village beyond the garden fence. The first few days in the cove are always the hardest. The silence can feel like a weight if you aren't used to carrying it. You try to fight it, to fill it with lists and noise, but the silence eventually wins. It always does. Liora shifted her weight, her gaze flickering toward the guest room. "I have a schedule. I'm trying to be intentional about my recovery." Farah smiled, a small, knowing curve of the lips. She set the pot on the counter, the liquid amber and glowing. Intentionality is a fine thing, Liora, but don't mistake a map for the journey. Isolation is a temporary necessity, a place to catch your breath, but it isn't a permanent state. The village doesn't want you to be a project, it just wants you to be here. As Farah spoke, the calico cat emerged from the guest room. It didn't rush. It navigated the hallway with a slow, tentative curiosity, sniffing the air as the scent of the herbal brew reached it. The cat stopped a few feet from Liora, its gaze alternating between the woman and the visitor. Liora looked down at the animal, then at the planner in the other room. For the first time since arriving in the cove, the rigid grid of her day felt absurd. The minutes she had allocated for mindful breathing and environmental assessments were meaningless in the face of a small breathing creature that simply wanted to know if she was safe. Liora reached down, her movements slow and devoid of the usual efficiency. She didn't try to scoop the cat up or force a bond. She simply extended a hand, palm open. The cat paused, its whiskers twitching, and then leaned in, brushing its cheek against her knuckles. The fur was coarse and warm, a tactile reality that grounded her more than any breathing exercise ever had. Liora felt a sudden sharp prick of something like grief, not for what she had lost in the city, but for the years she had spent treating her own life as a series of deliverables. She's a wanderer, that one, Farah noted, her voice dropping to a soothing hum. She belongs to the village, which is to say, she belongs to whoever is listening most closely at the moment. She has a knack for finding the people who are holding their breath. Farah began to tell a story, her voice weaving a tapestry of the village's shared history, of the great storm of '84 that had reshaped the shoreline, and the way the locals had spent the month rebuilding each other's fences before thinking about their own. She spoke of the cove, not as a destination, but as a living organism, and she spoke of Liora, not as a guest or a burnout, but as a missing piece of a puzzle that had finally drifted ashore. Liora listened, and as she did, the internal noise, the high-pitched whine of the metropolis, the pressure of the Michelin stars, the relentless demand for perfection, began to dim. It was replaced by the rhythmic cadence of Farah's voice and the soft, rhythmic puffing of the cat's breath. The air in the kitchen felt lighter, as if the house itself were exhaling. When Farah finally gathered her things to leave, she patted Liora's shoulder with a firm, lingering warmth. The tea will keep you warm. The cat will keep you present. The rest will take care of itself. As the door clicked shut, leaving Liora in the deepening twilight, the calico cat didn't return to the guest room. Instead, it leapt with a sudden, agile grace onto Liora's lap as she sank into the wooden kitchen chair. The cat curled into a tight circle, its weight a surprising and solid anchor. Then it began to purr, a deep, vibrating resonance that echoed in Liora's chest. It was a sound of absolute contentment, a frequency that demanded nothing and offered everything. Liora rested her hand on the cat's back, closing her eyes. She didn't check the clock, she didn't think about the next hour. She simply sat in the gathering dark, anchored to the present by a small, vibrating heart. The hum of the kiln. The heavy oak door groaned against the floorboards, resisting Liora's push until it gave way with a sudden, jarring snap. She stepped inside and was immediately enveloped by a scent so thick it felt structural, damp earth, mineral salt, and the sharp tang of oxidizing iron. Underpinning it all was the low-frequency thrum of the electric kiln, a vibration that didn't just hit the ears but settled deep in the marrow of her ribs, humming like a dormant engine. At the center of the room, Rohan Deshmukh stood over a spinning wheel. He didn't look up. His head was tilted slightly to the side, his focus narrowed to the point where his fingers met the whirling mound of gray clay. He seemed to be listening to the material, gauging its centrifugal tension by the sound of the friction. Liora remained frozen by the door, her boots leaving faint, dusty prints on the concrete floor. He offered a slow, singular nod, a recognition of her presence that stopped just short of a greeting. Liora felt the familiar, sharp spike of social vertigo. In the city, a first meeting was a choreographed sequence of handshakes, exchanged titles, and the precise adjustment of professional warmth. She began to mentally catalog the protocols. Should she introduce herself first, or wait for him to invite her forward? Was there etiquette for entering a private studio? She found herself rubbing her thumb against her fingertips, a rhythmic, desperate attempt to anchor her racing thoughts. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was heavy, and she felt an instinctive urge to fill it with a polite, meaningless sentence just to stop the ringing in her ears. "You're holding your breath," Rohan said. His voice was a low resonance, mirroring the hum of the kiln, steady and devoid of urgency. He still hadn't looked at her, his hands continuing to coax the clay upward into a slender, trembling cylinder. "The air here is heavy, but it's clean. You can let it in." Liora exhaled, a long, shaky breath that felt like collapsing. "I didn't want to interrupt. I didn't know if I was expected." "Expectation is a loud noise," Rohan replied. He finally slowed the wheel, the whir descending in pitch until it stopped. He wiped his hands on a canvas apron smeared with dried slip, his movements slow and deliberate. He studied her then, his gaze not searching or demanding, but simply observant. "Sit. Just sit for a while. There is no protocol for the clay." He pointed toward a weathered wooden stool tucked beside a workbench cluttered with calipers and sculpting tools. Liora sat, her spine rigid, the ghost of a kitchen line, the shouting, the timers, the frantic precision of a tasting menu, still echoing in the back of her mind. For the first few minutes, the silence felt like a confrontation. She watched the way the dust motes danced in the shafts of light cutting through the high, salt-filmed windows. She listened to the distant, rhythmic crash of the tide against the pebbles outside, a sound that seemed to synchronize with the slow drip of a leak somewhere in the back of the studio. They spent 20 minutes in that stillness. Rohan returned to his work, starting a new piece, the wet slap of clay hitting the wheel the only punctuation in the quiet. Liora found her shoulders dropping an inch at a time. The pressure to perform, to be the recovered version of herself, began to dissolve. For the first time in years, she wasn't the conductor of a chaotic orchestra, she was merely a witness to a slow process. The silence stopped feeling like a void and started feeling like a shelter. "It's a peculiar thing, isn't it?" The voice belonged to Giselle. Liora jumped slightly, turning to see the older woman leaning against the doorframe, her expression one of serene amusement. Giselle drifted into the room with a light, airy grace, holding a small, glossy photograph in her hand. She approached Liora, her presence bringing a scent of dried lavender and old paper. "Rohan is a master of the quiet," Giselle murmured, her low accent slowing the tempo of the air. She held out the photograph. It showed a Japanese vase, its surface a map of jagged gold veins that held together a dozen shattered fragments. "Look at this. Kintsugi. The art of precious scars." Liora took the photo, her eyes tracing the gold lines. "It's broken," she whispered. "It was broken," Giselle corrected, a slow, lingering blink accompanying her words. "But the repair is not an attempt to hide the damage. The gold highlights the break. It acknowledges that the object has a history, a trauma, and that the act of surviving that trauma makes it more valuable than a piece that has never known a fall. The flaw becomes the feature." Liora felt a sudden, hot tightness in her throat. She thought of the burnout, the night she had simply stopped being able to function, the way her mind had fractured under the weight of 1,000 expectations. For months, she had viewed that collapse as a catastrophic failure, a crack in her professional identity that she needed to seal and hide. She had treated her recovery like a renovation project, trying to return to the original version of herself. "We spend so much time trying to be seamless," Giselle continued, her voice a soft, lingering hum. "But seamless is boring. Seamless has no story. The gold is where the strength is." Liora set the photograph down on the workbench. Her gaze wandered to a shelf of drying pots, their surfaces matte and uneven. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough, gritty edge of a bowl that had slumped slightly to one side during its first drying phase. It was imperfect. It was leaning. It was entirely honest. The physical reality of the unfinished object grounded her. It didn't demand perfection, it only demanded to exist. She realized then that the burnout hadn't been a wall she had hit, but a breaking point that had cleared the way for something else. She wasn't a broken machine to be fixed, she was a vessel that had shattered, and the space between the pieces was where the new life could actually begin to flow. The grief she had been carrying, the loss of her status, her speed, her rigor shifted into something resembling curiosity. Rohan had stopped his wheel. He was watching her, his head tilted, his expression steady and knowing. He didn't ask her if she was okay, he didn't offer a platitude. He simply reached into the bucket of wet clay and pulled out a heavy, cool lump, placing it on the workbench in front of her. "The clay doesn't care who you were in the city," he said, his voice resonant and low. "It only cares about the pressure of your hands right now. Do you want to feel it?" Liora looked at the gray mass, then at her own hands, hands that had spent a decade striving for a surgical, sterile perfection. She reached out and pressed her palm into the cool, yielding mud, feeling the grit against her skin and the sudden, grounding weight of the earth. Centering the earth. The clay was colder than Liora expected, a heavy chill that seeped into the marrow of her wrists. As she pressed her palms into the gray mass, a decade in professional kitchens surged back with reflexive clarity. She didn't just touch the clay, she attempted to command it. Her fingers locked, her shoulders squaring as she applied a precise downward force to coerce the mud into a symmetrical cylinder. She sought the same clinical exactitude she had used to plate tasting menus for 40 people, the kind of perfection where error was a fireable offense. For a few seconds it worked. The mass smoothed into a blur of wet gray, but the wheel was faster than her hands, and the clay began to shudder. A subtle wobble shifted into a violent oscillation, the centrifugal force fighting her stubborn grip. With a wet slap, the cylinder buckled and collapsed into a glistening lump that splattered mud across Liora's forearm. She froze, her breath catching in a jagged hitch. The failure triggered a phantom echo of a shouting sous chef, and the suffocating pressure of a dinner rush. She felt the familiar hot tightening in her chest. "You are fighting the earth, Miss Okoro, and the earth always wins that particular argument." Liora jumped. In the corner of the studio, leaning against a stack of seasoned planks, stood Ishan Tanaka. Dressed in a linen shirt of pale gray, his posture was as straight as a plumb line. He adjusted his glasses with a slow lift of his index finger, tracking the wreckage on the wheel with clinical detachment. "Your approach is too clinical," Ishan continued, stepping forward. He didn't enter the immediate circle of the wheel, but his presence felt like a boundary. "You are treating the clay as if it were stainless steel or a precise measurement of salt. You are attempting to impose a will upon it rather than negotiating a space with it. In this village, we find that the harder one pushes, the more the medium pushes back." Liora rubbed her thumb against her fingertips, a grounding motion. "Precision isn't a flaw," she said, her voice soft but edged with defensiveness. "In my world, precision kept the chaos at bay. If the temperature was off by 2 degrees, the sauce broke. I don't know how to exist in a space where negotiating is the goal." Ishan tilted his head. "There is a difference between precision and rigidity. Precision is a tool. Rigidity is a cage. You seek a standard from a textbook, but beauty exists in the tension between the intended form and the natural resistance of the material. Structure must be a skeleton, not a suit of armor. By trying to eliminate the chaos, you are merely creating a different kind of disorder." Liora opened her mouth to argue that there was peace in a perfectly executed task, but the words died as warmth settled over her hands. Rohan had moved in silently. He didn't offer a critique. Instead, he slid his hands over hers, his palms broad and steady, smelling of damp earth and cedarwood. He layered his pressure over hers, his fingers interlocking to create a single, unified grip on the spinning clay. "Stop holding your breath," Rohan murmured, his voice a low hum that vibrated through Liora's ribcage. "Don't try to move the clay. Just feel where it wants to go and follow it." The heat of his hands melted the tension in her shoulders. Liora focused on the rhythm of his breathing. Slow, deep, and instinctively matched it. As her lungs expanded in sync with his, her grip softened. She stopped fighting the centrifugal force and leaned into it, allowing the clay to slide through the valley of their joined palms. It was a revelation of tactile intimacy. The clay, once an enemy, became a fluid medium of communication. Through the wet grit, Liora felt the subtle shifts in Rohan's pressure, the way he guided her to pivot her wrists a fraction of a degree. The hum of the kiln and the distant call of gulls faded. For the first time in years, the internal checklist of optimizations and failures fell silent. There was only the cool slip of the mud and the grounding weight of Rohan's hands. Slowly, the lump began to rise. It wasn't a sterile, mathematical cylinder, but something more organic, a swelling curve that felt honest. Liora felt a release of pressure in her chest, a long, shuddering breath she had been holding since the night she walked out of her restaurant. The clay danced between them in a revolving orbit of gray and gold light. Ishan watched from the periphery. He saw the way her jaw unclenched, the way her eyes lost their frantic, searching quality. He adjusted his glasses again, recognizing the shift. It wasn't the chaos he had feared, but the discipline of surrender. As the wheel slowed to a stop, Rohan gently withdrew. The sudden absence of his warmth left Liora feeling momentarily exposed. She looked down at the piece, a small, simple bowl. As she leaned in, she noticed a slight, natural dip on the left side, a gentle indentation where the clay had resisted her for a split second before yielding. In her old life, Liora would have scraped the clay off the wheel and started over to erase the evidence of her hesitation. But as she stared at the dip, she remembered Giselle's words about the gold in the cracks. The flaw wasn't a mistake, it was a record of the moment she had stopped fighting. It was a thumbprint of her own humanity. She traced the curve with a soft, lingering curiosity. For the first time, the imperfection felt like the only part of the object that actually mattered. "It's not symmetrical," Ishan observed, his voice having lost its sharp edge. Liora looked up and smiled, a genuine movement that reached her eyes. "I know," she replied. "That's why I like it." Ishan paused, looking at the bowl and then at Liora, his brow furrowing. "Then the question is, do you have the courage to leave it that way?" The golden hearth. The cedar logs popped in the hearth, a sharp, rhythmic percussion that punctuated the low hum of the evening. Liora didn't jump at the sound. Instead, she watched a single ember drift upward, glowing like a dying star before vanishing into the chimney. She stood at the small wooden counter, the scent of dried chamomile and honey hanging heavy in the air. In the city, her tea service would have been a choreography of efficiency, timed to the second, scaled for volume, executed with a precision that left no room for the steam to simply exist. Now, she moved with a deliberate, almost luxurious slowness. She watched the water reach a simmer, the tiny bubbles clustering at the bottom of the pot like pearls, and she waited. She didn't check a clock. She simply waited for the water to tell her it was ready. Rohan was already there, settled into the low-slung linen sofa that smelled faintly of salt and old books. The calico cat had claimed the space between them, a warm, vibrating weight that anchored them both to the present. Liora poured the tea, the amber liquid cascading into the cups in a steady, silent stream. As she handed a cup to Rohan, her fingers brushed his. It wasn't a frantic touch, but a grounding one. He didn't pull away, he tilted his head slightly to the side, his gaze lingering on her face with a resonant, quiet intensity that felt like a conversation in itself. They sat in a silence that had evolved. It was no longer the void Liora had feared, the kind of silence that demanded to be filled with productivity or chatter, but a living thing, soft and breathable. "You've stopped counting," Rohan said, his voice low and steady, like the hum of a kiln in the early morning. He wasn't looking at the tea, but at the way she held her cup loose, without the white-knuckled grip of someone trying to hold on to a slipping ledge. Liora smiled, the movement slow and genuine. "I think I've forgotten how to count the things that don't matter." A crisp knock at the door interrupted them, followed by the entrance of Ishan. He didn't enter so much as he occupied the space, his posture straight, though the rigidity had softened into something more akin to a weathered branch than a steel rod. In his hand he carried a scroll of heavy rice paper. He paused in the entryway, his eyes scanning the room, the flickering fire, the sleeping cat, the steam rising from the mugs. He adjusted his glasses with a single finger, a habit that usually signaled a critique in progress, but today his expression was uncharacteristically open. "I spent the afternoon in the study," Ishan remarked, his voice clear and precise. He unrolled the paper on the table, revealing a series of calligraphy characters. The ink was bold, but the lines didn't follow the strict, geometric perfection of a textbook. There were places where the brush had lingered, creating a soft bleed of ink, a drift in the stroke that suggested a willingness to let the hand wander. Liora leaned in, her thumb absent-mindedly rubbing against her fingertips. "It's different," she whispered. "It's less certain." "Precisely," Ishan replied, a small, wry smile touching his lips. "I spent 40 years chasing the perfect line, believing that precision was the only path to truth. But watching you in the studio, watching you embrace that dip in the clay, I realized I had been fighting the tide. I have begun to appreciate the beauty of the drift. The error is where the life is." They shifted their conversation toward the concept of home, a topic that had once felt like a precarious bridge for Liora. For years, home had been a series of high-rent zip codes and stainless steel kitchens, places where she slept but never resided. But as the fire cast long, dancing shadows across the linen walls, Liora realized the noise in her mind, the constant, buzzing ledger of accolades, critics, and expectations, had faded into a distant murmur. She wasn't a visitor here, playing the role of the recovering professional. She felt the grain of the wooden floor beneath her feet and the warmth of the hearth, and for the first time she felt the architecture of her own life shifting to fit the landscape of the cove. Liora reached for the small, imperfect bowl she had brought back from the studio. It sat on the side table, still raw and earthy. She picked it up, her thumb finding the gentle indentation on the left side, the flaw that Ishan had challenged her to keep. She closed her eyes and focused on the sensation. She zoomed in on the texture, the gritty resistance of the fired clay, the cool dip where the wall collapsed slightly, the organic irregularity of the rim. It was a physical record of a moment of hesitation, a thumbprint of her own fragility. She thought of the restaurant in the city, the Michelin stars, the frantic energy of a brigade of chefs moving in synchronized terror, the prestige that felt like a golden cage. She remembered the night she had walked out, the sheer terror of losing a status she had spent a decade building. Looking at the bowl, she realized that the trade had been an absolute bargain. She had exchanged a glittering hollow monument to perfection for a quiet room and the courage to be flawed. The cost of her former life was a price she was more than happy to pay for the right to breathe without permission. A soft, melodic voice drifted through the open door, announcing Farah's arrival. The village matriarch didn't wait for an invitation, gliding in with a bundle of dried herbs tied with a piece of twine. She smelled of peppermint and old earth. Farah placed the herbs on the counter with a warm, open-palm gesture, her presence enveloping the room like a thick wool blanket. "Lavender and lemon balm for the restless nights," Farah said, her voice a comforting cadence. She studied the three of them, the former architect, the scholar, and the chef, and her eyes crinkled with a maternal satisfaction. "You all look as though you've finally learned how to sit still. It's a rare art, that." Farah lingered for a few minutes, sharing a piece of village gossip about the migrating whales, her voice weaving into the atmosphere of the room. When she finally departed, she left behind a sense of total integration. Liora felt the circle close. She was no longer an outlier observing a community, but a thread woven into the fabric of Salt Spray Cove. The group settled back into their seats. The only urgency remaining in the room was the slow, inevitable cooling of the tea in their mugs. The fire had settled into a deep, pulsing red glow, casting a warmth that seemed to seep into their very bones. Liora felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of safety, a lightness in her chest that made her feel as though she might float if not for the weight of the cat on her lap. Slowly, almost tentatively, Liora leaned her head onto Rohan's shoulder. He shifted slightly, adjusting his weight to support her, his presence a steady, humming anchor. Liora stared into the heart of the hearth, watching the last of the cedar logs collapse into a heap of silver ash. The internal monologue that had played like a recording of a crashing city for 10 years had finally, completely stopped. There was no list of things to optimize, no ghost of a critic to satisfy. There was only the scent of lavender, the warmth of a shoulder, and the profound, holy silence of a life finally slowed down.